By the time the offensive was launched, German reserves existed largely as a theoretical concept rather than a practical military tool. On operational maps and staff tables, the Wehrmacht still appeared to possess depth. Army Group headquarters listed divisions in reserve, corps commanders reported formations available for counterattack, and higher command continued to assume that fresh forces could be inserted where the front came under pressure. On paper, the system looked intact. In reality, it had already begun to fail. German reserves were no longer cohesive, mobile formations capable of restoring a broken front. They had been eroded by months of continuous fighting, attrition, and emergency commitments. Units designated as reserves were often already tied down, holding quiet sectors that could not be abandoned. Political directives and ideological rigidity prevented withdrawals, forcing commanders to disperse their remaining strength across extended lines rather than preserve it for decisive action. Many reserve divisions were understrength to a degree that made their classification misleading. Infantry battalions were reduced in numbers, artillery complements were incomplete, and vehicle shortages were severe. Some formations existed as reassembled remnants of previously destroyed units, rushed back into the order of battle, without adequate refit or training. Others were newly raised divisions lacking combat experience, trained under shortened programs, and led by officers stretched thin by casualties and promotions. Mobility, once the defining feature of German operational doctrine, had sharply declined. Fuel shortages were no longer episodic but structural. Reserve units that depended on rapid road movement now faced rationed allocations that limited both speed and distance. Rail transport, increasingly vital, had become unreliable due to sustained Allied air interdiction. Marshalling yards, bridges, and junctions were frequently damaged, creating delays that turned movement orders into logistical obstacles. As a result, reserves often arrived late or in fragments. Units reached assembly areas without full complements, without fuel, or without heavy equipment. In some cases, formations received movement orders only to have them countermanded or delayed as priorities shifted elsewhere along the front. The reserve system required speed and concentration to function. By this stage of the war, it provided neither. Air superiority further undermined the usefulness of German reserves. Daylight movement had become hazardous. Columns on roads or rail lines risked immediate detection and attack. This forced commanders to move units at night, slowing deployment and increasing confusion. Attempts to mass forces for counterattacks were frequently broken up before they could be launched, compelling commanders to commit reserves in small packets rather than as unified formations. This incremental commitment stripped reserves of their intended purpose. Instead of delivering decisive counterblows, they were consumed as stopgap measures, fed directly into defensive fighting to plug gaps as they appeared. Once committed in this manner, they ceased to exist as reserves in any operational sense. The quality of manpower within reserve formations also declined. Veteran units that once provided experienced depth had been expended in earlier battles. Replacement systems struggled to keep pace with losses, resulting in units filled with younger, less trained soldiers, and a growing proportion of convalescents returned prematurely to duty. Leadership shortages compounded the problem as experienced officers and non-commissioned officers had been killed or reassigned, leaving gaps that training programs could not rapidly fill. Despite these realities, German planning assumptions remained largely unchanged. Higher command continued to believe that reserves could be assembled, moved, and committed quickly enough to blunt a major offensive. Orders were issued on the expectation that divisions would arrive intact, deploy efficiently, and counterattack according to doctrine. These assumptions were no longer grounded in operational reality. The offensive therefore did not begin against a resilient defensive system with depth and flexibility. It struck an army whose reserve structure had already been hollowed out by attrition, logistical strain, and strategic overextension. The appearance of strength concealed a system that lacked the capacity to absorb shock or recover from disruption. When the first attacks went in, the decisive question was not whether German frontline units would hold. It was whether the reserve system, central to German defensive doctrine, could still function at all. The answer would be delivered rapidly. The offensive did not strike at random. It was directed against a sector where German command already depended heavily on reserves to maintain stability. By this stage of the war, the German front had become increasingly linear. Defensive depth had been sacrificed to cover extended territory, leaving few areas with layered positions capable of absorbing a major blow. Certain sectors were held deliberately thin, based on the assumption that reserves could be moved in quickly if an attack developed. It was precisely one of these sectors that became the focus of the offensive. The chosen area sat at the junction of multiple operational pressures. It guarded key road and rail corridors that linked German rear areas to the front line. These routes were essential for moving supplies, artillery, and, most critically, reserve formations. Losing control here did not simply mean giving up ground. It threatened to disrupt movement across a much wider front. German planners believed this sector could be held initially by existing forces and stabilized by reserves once the scale of the attack became clear. The terrain appeared favorable for defense, with natural obstacles that could slow an advance and buy time. Previous fighting in the area had reinforced the belief that determined resistance, supported by timely counterattacks, could prevent a breakthrough. This assumption underestimated how much the balance had shifted. The offensive opened with concentrated pressure rather than broad probing attacks. Instead of testing the line evenly, Allied forces struck decisively at points where German formations were thinnest and most reliant on reinforcement. Firepower was massed to overwhelm local defenses quickly, compressing the timeline available for German reaction. This was not merely a tactical choice, but an operational one. The aim was to deny German command the time needed to identify the main effort, issue clear orders, and bring reserves forward in an organized manner. Speed mattered more than territorial gains in the opening phase. Every hour lost reduced the chances of an effective counterstroke. As the initial attacks broke through forward positions, German commanders faced immediate dilemmas. Communications from frontline units reported penetrations earlier than expected, and on a scale that suggested a major offensive, not a limited operation. Yet the exact axis of advance remained unclear, complicating decisions about where to commit reserves. The geography of the sector compounded these problems. Road networks converged toward the front, creating bottlenecks that limited movement even under ideal conditions. Rail lines, already damaged by air attacks, could not handle sudden surges in traffic. Reserve units, attempting to move toward the threatened area, found themselves delayed, rerouted, or halted entirely. Meanwhile, the offensive continued to expand laterally. Attacks were widened deliberately to prevent German command from isolating the breakthrough and sealing it off. Each expansion forced defenders to stretch further, drawing in local reserves that might otherwise have been held back for a coordinated response. This created a cascading effect. Units earmarked as reserves were pulled directly into frontline fighting almost immediately, often without adequate preparation or coordination. Once committed, they could not be withdrawn easily, especially under constant pressure. The reserve pool began to shrink within hours of the offensive's opening. German expectations that reserves could restore balance depended on three conditions: clear identification of the main threat, rapid movement to the point of decision, and the ability to concentrate forces before committing them. The manner and location of the offensive undermined all three simultaneously. The sector chosen for the attack forced German command into reactive decision-making from the outset. Instead of shaping the battle through planned counterattacks, commanders were compelled to respond piecemeal to unfolding crises. Each delay increased the depth of the penetration, while each premature commitment reduced the strength available for later action. By the end of the first phase, it was clear that the offensive had achieved more than local success. It had struck where the German defensive system depended most heavily on reserves. And it had done so with a speed and concentration that left little room for recovery. The stage was set for the decisive test, whether German reserves, already strained and fragmented, could still be brought together in time to contain what was rapidly becoming a full-scale breakthrough. That test would come sooner than German command expected. The decisive feature of the opening phase was not the scale of the assault, but its speed. German defensive planning relied on time. Time to identify the main axis of attack, time to verify reports, time to move reserves into position, and time to organize counterattacks before penetrations could widen. The offensive denied that time almost immediately. Initial assaults achieved success faster than German command anticipated. Forward defensive positions were overrun or bypassed within hours, not days. In several areas, units reported losing contact with neighboring formations almost as soon as the attack began. Communications, already strained, became unreliable as headquarters struggled to maintain an accurate picture of the front. This rapid dislocation had immediate operational consequences. German commanders could not be certain whether they were facing a localized breakthrough or the main effort of a major offensive. Orders were issued cautiously, often with caveats, while confirmation was sought. By the time the situation became clear, the window for decisive action had already narrowed. Allied forces exploited this hesitation by pushing forward continuously. Instead of pausing to consolidate gains, advance elements maintained pressure, driving deeper into German positions. This forced defenders to commit units piecemeal, often without coordination, simply to slow the advance. Each such commitment reduced the reserves available for a larger counterstroke. The speed of the breakthrough also disrupted German command rhythms. Planning cycles designed for deliberate operations could not keep pace with events unfolding hour by hour. Reports from the front arrived late or contradicted one another. Staff officers worked with incomplete information, attempting to interpret a battlefield that was changing faster than their decision-making processes allowed. Movement constraints compounded these problems. Reserve units attempting to deploy encountered congested roads and damaged rail lines. Orders to advance were frequently overtaken by events requiring rerouting or cancellation. Some formations moved toward assembly areas that were already threatened or overrun by the time they arrived. Air pressure intensified the effect. German units moving during daylight were subjected to attacks that further slowed progress and increased confusion. Columns broke up to avoid detection, delaying arrival and dispersing strength. The very measures taken to survive movement reduced the ability to concentrate forces at decisive points. As the breakthrough widened, German command faced an escalating dilemma. Holding back reserves risked losing control of the front entirely. Committing them too early risked squandering the last operational depth available. The speed of the advance forced decisions before conditions for effective counteraction existed. Attempts to organize counterattacks revealed the consequences of lost time. Units assembled under fire, lacking full strength or clear objectives. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was often improvised. Instead of striking a focused blow, these efforts devolved into local actions that absorbed manpower without restoring the situation. Within a short period, the offensive had achieved a depth that fundamentally altered the battle. Penetrations were no longer shallow disruptions, but expanding breaches. German commanders could no longer realistically hope to seal them with reserves alone. The opportunity to restore a coherent defensive line had passed. The speed of the breakthrough did not merely overwhelm frontline defenses, it rendered the reserve system ineffective by depriving it of the conditions it required to function. Time, concentration, and coordination all essential, were lost in the opening hours. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but a progressive erosion. Each delayed response, each fragmented movement, and each failed counterattack compounded the damage. The reserve system was being consumed faster than it could be employed. The question was no longer whether reserves could stop the offensive. It was whether they could even slow it long enough to prevent a broader operational disaster. That question would be answered in the next phase, as German command attempted to concentrate what remained of its reserves under increasingly hostile conditions. The failure of German reserves was not the result of a single breakdown, but of multiple constraints acting simultaneously. Even where reserves still existed in meaningful numbers, the conditions required to bring them together no longer existed. Concentration had once been the foundation of German operational doctrine. Reserves were meant to be held back, moved rapidly, and committed in mass at the decisive moment. By this stage of the war, each step in that process had become increasingly difficult to execute. The offensive exploited those weaknesses systematically. Transportation was the first and most obvious limitation. Road networks near the front were already strained by routine supply traffic. As the offensive developed, these routes became congested with retreating units, supply columns attempting to move forward, and reserve formations trying to reach assembly areas. Movement slowed to a crawl. Vehicles broke down. Fuel was wasted idling in traffic, and command control over columns deteriorated. Rail transport offered no reliable alternative. Allied air attacks had reduced rail capacity well before the offensive began. Key junctions, bridges, and marshalling yards had been damaged repeatedly, forcing trains to detour or stop entirely. Schedules collapsed under the strain of sudden operational demand. Reserve units arriving by rail often disembarked far from their intended destinations, requiring additional road movement that further delayed concentration. Fuel shortages magnified every delay. Reserve formations received allocations calculated for ideal conditions, not for prolonged congestion, detours, and interruptions. As a result, units frequently exhausted their fuel before reaching assembly areas. Some formations arrived with vehicles immobilized, reducing their combat effectiveness before a single engagement had taken place. Others were forced to abandon heavy equipment altogether. Air superiority ensured that these problems could not be solved quickly. German commanders were increasingly reluctant to move large formations during daylight. Any attempt to concentrate forces risked immediate detection and attack. As a result, movement was pushed into nighttime hours, compressing already limited windows and increasing confusion. Units arrived tired, disorganized, and behind schedule. This constraint had a critical operational effect. Because reserves could not be moved safely and rapidly, commanders hesitated to commit them en masse. Instead, they fed units forward incrementally, committing battalions or regiments as they arrived rather than waiting for full divisions to assemble. This undermined the very purpose of reserves. Piecemeal commitment produced local resistance but no decisive counterblow. Communications failures compounded the problem. As the front shifted rapidly, command posts were forced to relocate. Signal lines were cut, radio traffic increased, and clarity declined. Orders issued from higher headquarters were often based on outdated information. Reserve units received instructions that no longer matched the situation on the ground, leading to misdirected movements and wasted effort. Coordination between arms also suffered. Effective counterattacks required infantry, armor, artillery, and engineers to operate together. Fragmented movement meant these elements arrived separately, if at all. Artillery units lacked ammunition or communications links. Armor arrived without infantry support. Infantry advanced without adequate fire support. Each failed attempt further reduced available strength. The cumulative effect was decisive. German reserves were no longer withheld, assembled, and unleashed. They were absorbed into the front as it collapsed, losing their identity as operational instruments. Once committed in this manner, they could not be reconstituted or redeployed. Importantly, this was not a failure of will or discipline. German commanders recognized the problem, but they lacked the means to overcome it. The reserve system depended on mobility, concealment, and coordination. The offensive denied all three. As reserves failed to concentrate, German command lost its last opportunity to regain initiative. The ability to shape the battle passed entirely to the attackers. Defensive actions became reactive, focused on delaying and containing rather than reversing momentum. By the time the situation stabilized temporarily, the damage was already done. Reserves had been spent without achieving decisive results. What remained were frontline units stretched thin, facing continued pressure without depth behind them. The reserve system, once central to German defensive doctrine, had effectively ceased to exist as an operational force. What followed would demonstrate the consequences of that loss, as attempts at counterattack revealed just how little flexibility remained. With the reserve system already strained, German command still attempted to regain control through counterattacks. These efforts were not optional. Doctrine, experience, and necessity all pointed toward immediate action. If the advance could not be reversed, it at least had to be slowed. What followed exposed how completely the conditions for effective counterattack had disappeared. Counterattacks were planned quickly and executed under pressure. In theory, they were meant to strike the flanks of advancing forces, restore coherence to the front, and buy time for further reinforcement. In practice, they were launched with incomplete forces, inadequate preparation, and limited coordination. Speed was forced not by opportunity, but by desperation. The first problem was mass. Counterattacks relied on concentrating sufficient combat power at a chosen point. German units simply could not achieve this anymore. Formations arrived in fragments, battalions without full regimental support, armor without infantry, infantry without artillery. Instead of delivering a decisive blow, these attacks produced brief, localized resistance that could not alter the broader situation. Timing further undermined their effectiveness. Counterattacks were often launched too late to exploit temporary opportunities. By the time units assembled, the offensive had already moved forward or expanded laterally. German attacks struck positions that were no longer decisive, wasting strength without restoring stability. In some cases, units advanced toward objectives that had already been bypassed. Fire support was inconsistent. Artillery units struggled with ammunition shortages, disrupted communications, and shifting front lines. Coordinated barrages, essential for suppressing enemy defenses during counterattacks, were difficult to organize. Without sustained fire support, attacking units advanced under unfavorable conditions, suffering losses without achieving penetration. Air pressure remained constant. German counterattacking forces, once exposed, became targets. Movement to the line of departure, concentration in assembly areas, and even the attack itself were vulnerable to air attack. This forced units to disperse, delay, or abort actions entirely. Each aborted or disrupted attempt further eroded confidence and capability. Command and control problems compounded these difficulties. Orders were issued rapidly and frequently revised as the situation evolved. Units received conflicting instructions or were redirected mid-movement. Subordinate commanders often lacked a clear understanding of the broader operational plan, limiting their ability to adapt once engaged. As losses mounted, the quality of counterattacks declined further. Units that had already been weakened were thrown back into action with little time to reorganize. Casualties among officers and non-commissioned officers reduced cohesion and initiative. Replacement personnel, arriving under chaotic conditions, were absorbed into units already under stress. The psychological effect was significant, though not dramatic. Counterattacks no longer carried the expectation of success. They were undertaken as delaying actions rather than decisive maneuvers. This shift in expectation altered how they were planned and executed. Objectives became limited, time horizons shortened, and withdrawal plans were prepared almost from the outset. Each failed counterattack consumed what remained of the reserve system. Forces that might once have been held back for a coordinated response were committed prematurely and expended. The distinction between reserve and frontline unit disappeared entirely. By this stage, German command was no longer attempting to restore the original defensive line. The goal shifted towards slowing the advance and preventing encirclement. Counterattacks became tools of damage control rather than instruments of recovery. The cumulative result was clear. The offensive had not only broken through the front, it had neutralized the mechanisms intended to respond to such a breakthrough. Counterattacks failed not because they were poorly conceived in principle, but because the conditions required for their success no longer existed. What followed was an even more dangerous phase, as command structures struggled to adapt to a battlefield that no longer resembled the assumptions under which they had been built. As the offensive continued and counterattacks failed to restore stability, the strain shifted decisively onto German command structures. What had begun as a tactical crisis became an operational one, and then a systemic failure of control. German command relied on a chain of information that assumed relative stability. Frontline reports moved upward, assessments were consolidated, and orders flowed back down. The speed and fluidity of the offensive disrupted this cycle. Reports arrived late, incomplete, or contradictory. Units lost contact with adjacent formations, making it difficult to determine the true shape of the front. Headquarters at Corps and Army level struggled to maintain situational awareness. Maps were updated continuously, yet they lagged behind events. Commanders were forced to make decisions based on estimates rather than verified positions. This uncertainty encouraged caution at precisely the moment when decisive action was required. Orders reflected this confusion. Instructions were frequently revised as new information emerged. Units were redirected while already in motion, wasting time and energy. Some formations received overlapping or conflicting orders from different levels of command, further degrading coordination. In the effort to respond quickly, clarity was sacrificed. The breakdown was not limited to communication. Physical displacement of command posts became increasingly common as the front shifted. Headquarters relocated under pressure, disrupting staff work and severing signal lines. Each move created gaps in command continuity that took time to repair. During these intervals, subordinate units often acted independently, further fragmenting the defensive effort. Higher command intervention intensified the problem. Strategic directives, shaped by political and ideological considerations, constrained operational flexibility. Orders to hold ground at all costs limited the ability of commanders to conduct controlled withdrawals or regroup reserves effectively. The result was a defensive posture that absorbed pressure without adapting to it. As the situation deteriorated, command increasingly focused on crisis management rather than operational design. Efforts were directed toward plugging gaps, preventing encirclements, and stabilizing sectors long enough to extract threatened units. Planning horizons shortened from days to hours. Long-term solutions were deferred in favor of immediate survival. The reserve system, already weakened, suffered further under these conditions. Without clear command direction, reserve units were committed reactively. Decisions about where and when to deploy them were made under pressure, often without coordination between neighboring commands. This accelerated their consumption without producing strategic effect. Leadership losses compounded the breakdown. Officers and staff personnel were casualties of both combat and exhaustion. Replacements lacked familiarity with their units or the broader situation. Institutional knowledge eroded as experienced leaders were lost, further reducing the effectiveness of command decisions. Despite continued effort, German command could no longer impose coherence on the battlefield. The offensive had outpaced the structures designed to control it. Orders arrived too late, Warchie's forces moved too slowly, and decisions were overtaken by events. By this stage, the battle was no longer shaped by deliberate planning. It was driven by momentum. The attacking forces dictated tempo and direction, while defenders responded under increasingly unfavorable conditions. The collapse of command control did not produce an immediate rout. Instead, it manifested as a steady loss of initiative and flexibility. Each decision narrowed future options, making recovery less likely with every passing hour. The final consequence of this breakdown would become evident as the reserve system, once central to German defensive doctrine, was fully consumed, leaving no depth behind the front to absorb further shocks. By the time the command breakdown became evident, the German reserve system had already crossed the point of recovery. What remained was no longer a force held back for decisive action, but a collection of units being consumed as fast as they could be moved. Reserves were now committed as frontline troops almost immediately upon arrival. Divisions designated for counterattack were instead ordered to occupy defensive positions, plug gaps, or delay advances with no expectation of withdrawal. Once committed in this manner, they lost any operational flexibility. There was no second line to fall back to, no depth from which to rebuild. This transformation was not accidental. It was the inevitable result of sustained pressure combined with limited options. German commanders faced a choice between preserving reserves that might never arrive in time or committing them to prevent immediate collapse. In nearly every case, the latter prevailed. Short-term survival took precedence over long-term recovery. As reserves were absorbed into the front, the defensive system became increasingly linear. Positions were held shoulder to shoulder with little room to maneuver. Breakthroughs could no longer be contained by counterattacks from depth. Instead, they spread laterally, forcing neighboring units to retreat or risk encirclement. Each withdrawal exposed new flanks, accelerating the process. The loss of reserves also altered the character of resistance. Defensive actions became static and localized. Units fought where they stood, with limited ability to influence events beyond their immediate sector. Once pressure became overwhelming, retreat was often the only option, carried out under fire and without coordination. Logistical strain intensified the collapse. Supply routes were stretched and disrupted as the front shifted. Ammunition and fuel deliveries became erratic. Units that had arrived as reserves found themselves short of essential supplies within days, further reducing their effectiveness. Without depth, resupply became a continuous emergency rather than a planned process. Attempts to reconstitute reserves failed. Shattered units could not be withdrawn safely for refit. Replacement personnel arrived sporadically and were absorbed into existing formations under combat conditions. Equipment losses could not be replaced quickly enough to restore combat power. What might once have been a temporary setback became permanent degradation. The psychological effect on command was subtle, but decisive. Planning assumptions adjusted downward. Instead of asking how to restore the front, commanders focused on how long it could be held. Defensive objectives were shortened, timelines compressed, and expectations reduced. The reserve system, once a tool for shaping battles, became irrelevant to planning altogether. By this stage, the outcome of the offensive was no longer in doubt. The absence of reserves meant that any new penetration, however small, carried disproportionate risk. There was nothing left to absorb shock. Each success by the attackers compounded the strain on an already exhausted defense. The collapse of the reserve system marked a fundamental shift. It signaled the transition from organized defense to managed withdrawal, and eventually to uncontrolled retreat. Without reserves, German forces could not dictate terms, only react to them. What remained was a front held together by necessity rather than design. Units fought on, but without depth, flexibility, or the means to recover from further blows. The offensive had achieved more than territorial gains. It had eliminated the last mechanism by which German command could influence the course of the battle. All that remained was to understand what this meant beyond the immediate operation, how the destruction of the reserve system reshaped the wider campaign and sealed outcomes far beyond the battlefield itself. The offensive demonstrated a reality that German command had struggled to accept. The war had reached a stage where recovery, through operational skill alone, was no longer possible. For years, German doctrine had relied on the ability to absorb blows, shift forces, and regain initiative through the use of reserves. This approach had worked when mobility, coordination, and depth were intact. The offensive proved that those conditions no longer existed. Once the reserve system collapsed, there was no mechanism left to stabilize the front in a meaningful way. The destruction of German reserves did not produce an immediate, dramatic collapse. Instead, it imposed a permanent limitation. From this point forward, German forces could delay and resist, but they could not restore balance. Each defensive action consumed irreplaceable strength. Every withdrawal reduced options further. The significance of this outcome extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Without reserves, German command lost the ability to respond to unexpected developments elsewhere along the front. Any new offensive, even a limited one, carried the risk of triggering wider failure. Strategic flexibility disappeared as operational depth vanished. The offensive also illustrated the decisive importance of tempo. By compressing time and denying opportunities for reorganization, the attackers neutralized systems designed to manage crises. Speed did not simply overwhelm defenses, it rendered recovery mechanisms obsolete. Once that happened, even well-led units could not reverse the trend. This shift marked a broader transition in the war. German forces were no longer fighting to shape outcomes, but to manage decline. Decisions focused on mitigating losses rather than achieving objectives. Planning horizons shortened, and initiative passed entirely to the attackers. In this context, individual battles mattered less than cumulative effect. The offensive did not need to destroy every unit it encountered. It only needed to ensure that reserves were expended faster than they could be regenerated. Once that threshold was crossed, the outcome became a matter of time. The lesson was structural rather than tactical. Armies depend not only on frontline strength, but on the systems that support and renew it. When those systems fail, no amount of skill at the point of contact can compensate indefinitely. The offensive exposed that failure with clarity. It showed that German defenses, however determined, lacked the depth required to sustain prolonged pressure. The reserve system, once central to German operational success, had been reduced to a list of names without substance. From this point onward, the front could still bend, but it could not recover. Each new blow pushed it closer to collapse, and nothing remained behind it to stop the process. The offensive did not simply win ground, it ended a way of fighting. If you want to understand how World War II was actually fought, not just the outcomes, but the systems that decided them, this channel breaks each campaign down step by step. New analyses are uploaded regularly, covering major offensives, command decisions, and the mechanics behind victory and collapse. Subscribe to WW2 Battles to follow the war as it unfolded, one operation at a time.